I've been collecting video games for 11 or 12 years now, and today I think I have a decent-sized collection. Most of that is devoted to the NES, since that's one of the 3 primary consoles I collect for. Now, I'm not going to go over my entire library game by game, but I thought it'd be fun to focus on the juiciest, bloodiest, rarest NES games in my collection. As for how I'm determining the rarity of these games, I have a collector's app, which, while not indispensable by any means, is still a pretty handy resource for cataloging your game collection. And it has one particular feature for people like me who like their ego stroked every now and then. It gives you a trophy room, which then allows you to sort the games in your collection by value and rarity. Now, since some of these titles are less obvious than others, I've done some supplemental research with what is, without a doubt, the premier resource of video game information for enthusiasts all over the world, eBay. Nothing too fancy. If a game has only 5 or 6 listings, then yeah, I'd say it's probably pretty uncommon. And one quick disclaimer, I assembled this list using the app. So if you don't agree with all the choices on this list, well, don't blame me, blame society. Like most American kids growing up in the late 80s, I cut my video game teeth on the NES. And like about half those kids, I graduated in the 90s to the Sega Genesis. But my favorite video game system growing up was unquestionably the Nintendo Game Boy. The Game Boy was a perfect combination of 2 philosophies which have always been very important to me. Being able to play video games wherever I wanted and not having to share the TV. But just as important, for a kid with limited income, a $20 or $30 Game Boy game was a much lower impact purchase than a $50 or $60 NES or Genesis game. Because of that and my general obsession with handheld video game systems, I had over twice as many Game Boy games as I did for the NES and Genesis combined. And of these games, my favorite was Gargoyles Quest. Gargoyles Quest was a spin-off of the Ghosts and Goblins series, although I didn't make that connection at the time. At its core, it is an action platformer built around the unique abilities of its main character. Firebrand can cling to walls and hover for short periods of time, and during the course of the game, he gains additional offensive and defensive upgrades, as well as increasingly stronger wings to allow for longer bursts of flight. Capcom also mixed in some very light RPG elements, such as scattering each of the 6 main levels across a large overworld map and separating these core stages with towns and expository encounters with NPCs, as well as sprinkling in a few rudimentary fetch quests. These additions elevate a fairly standard action game into an epic, sprawling adventure, comparatively speaking of course, despite the fact that these RPG elements barely hide the fact that Gargoyles Quest is an incredibly linear game. Now here's the thing, I was so preoccupied with all things Game Boy that I pretty much ignored all the console releases. So while I was aware that a sequel to Gargoyles Quest had come out on the NES, I really didn't care. I just figured, meh, I'll get it when it comes out on Game Boy. It never did. But that's just as well because I forgot about it completely for another 15 years. Now for a number of years as I transitioned into adulthood, my interest in video games went into remission, but in 2008, it flared up again. For the first time, I started thinking about some of those older games that I had missed out on as a kid, and one game in particular stood out in my mind. So I hopped on eBay and zeroed in on the cheapest buy it now price I could find, which makes Gargoyles Quest 2 the first NES game that I bought as an adult, for $10.29. Now, I don't have a lot to say about this game because there's just not a lot to say about it. In fact, the title is actually a massive misnomer. It should have been called Gargoyles Quest 2 because this is basically the same game. Yeah, there's new areas and a handful of superficial changes, but for the most part, these are all aesthetic differences, and a new coat of paint does not a new game make. And it certainly doesn't hide the fact that you're being funneled through essentially the same plot, with the same story beats, fetching the same items for the same NPCs, powering up your character with the same upgrades, and fighting the same final boss for the same ending. There is one new weapon in the game that is pretty useful and kind of fun to use, But that's the only functional difference Gargoyles Quest 2 makes over the original. Now that kind of approach is fine for action games where gameplay pretty much trumps all other aspects of the game, but for games in the adventure genre, which usually have more of an emphasis on story and characters, you kind of want more of a progression from game to game other than adding just a single ability. Even Mega Man mixes it up more than that, for the most part. And don't talk to me about Mario, Legend of Zelda, Metroid. Nintendo has a knack for releasing the same game over and over and over again, and still managing to make each one feel like an entirely new experience. Capcom does not. Now I know it sounds like I'm being extremely harsh on this game, and that's not my intention. It's still a good game, and I heartily recommend it over 90% of the NES library. It's just that Gargoyles Quest deserved better than such an uninspired sequel that was basically just a colorized retread of the first game. Now, if you have no frame of reference, like you never played the original, or played it and can't remember anything about it, then by all means, start with this one. It's a prequel to the first game anyway. But for me, Gargoyles Quest 2 is a quintessential dead lay. Better than nothing, I suppose, but just going through the motions with minimal effort, and let's be honest, probably spending the entire time thinking about Pinterest. Now this next game is a bit of a wild card because even after all that I've read, I still question how rare this game actually is. And it takes up 2 slots on my trophy list because there are 2 components to it. Arkanoid. Now any plebeian can play this game with a standard NES controller and it works fine. But any retro gamer worth his salt knows that a game like this needs to be played with a paddle controller. So Taito created the official Arkanoid paddle controller. The controller itself is simple and pretty lightweight. You got your little spinny knob and your button. And underneath this cap right here is a potentiometer so you can adjust your on-screen paddle. Let's see how it works. Alright, hang on. Hey, it's me. Hey, the controller's not working. Yeah, I have it plugged in. Give me a little credit. Oh, really? Okay, I'll try that. Well, thanks. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, uh-huh. Okay, someone's at the door. I gotta go. Okay, so here's how this works. The Arkanoid controller plugs into port 2, and the regular controller plugs into port 1. What's interesting, though, is when the Arkanoid controller is plugged in, it kills the functionality for controller port 1. So all you can use this controller for is to switch between 1 and 2 players. And if that doesn't convince you the magic is real, I don't know what will. I'm guessing this is also why it doesn't work on the 4 score. And it actually works really well. Now I know what you're thinking. Can you use the Arkanoid controller to play Capcom's Legendary Wings? You cannot. Okay, how about Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road? No. Okay, maybe it only works on title games. Alright, let's try this. Oh hey, look at that! I'm kidding, it's pretty safe to assume that the Arkanoid controller only works on Arkanoid. And maybe Chase HQ. Like probably most collectors, when I first started buying games, I didn't jump immediately in the deep end with a bunch of indiscriminate purchases. No, I actually start with a very specific hit list of a dozen or so titles, mainly either my favorite games as a kid or titles that I felt that I just missed out on. Now, in these early days, I still had no intention of ending up with thousands of games, so the instinct to find the absolute best deal hadn't quite kicked in yet. Cost was not nearly the factor in those original purchases as it became for all the ones that followed. As a result, I probably spent more on those first 20 games than I did on the next 50. Metal Storm was one of these first games. Now, I bought this for just over $70, which to date is the most I spent on any game in my NES collection. Now, back in 2012, $70 for a complete copy was a pretty fair price, although now it can go for 3 or 4 times that much. Now, of course, on eBay, if you have no dignity and don't mind being seen as a raging douchebag, you can ask for whatever price you want. But know that just because you have the motor skills to physically type those numbers into the Buy It Now price field does not mean that's anywhere close what the game is actually worth. Ass. I'm sorry, what was I talking about? Ah yes, Metal Storm. Now, Metal Storm as a game is fantastic. It's an action platformer like Contra or Mega Man, only it separates itself with this fantastically innovative gravity flipping mechanic that even 30 years later you still don't see very often. Now, this makes for some very fun and challenging gameplay, and I do mean challenge. Death comes often in Metal Storm, but if it's any consolation, it also has some of the coolest death animation you'll find on the NES.